Siobhan, you're recording. Okay.
Done.
Okay. So let's let everybody in now. Yeah, they're coming in, I think. I think we also need to keep admitting people in as well, because they probably keep coming. So for those who are already inside this room, thank you so much for joining us for Global Lawyers Connect and Global Lawyers of Canada virtual webinar on the Canadian legal market. And yeah, thank you so much for you guys coming. And probably we will wait a little bit, maybe 2 to 3 minutes longer as well, because we also try to have everyone coming in already, because there are over 400 people registering for this session. Although at the end, we probably expect maybe close to 100 people, hopefully, will actually appear for this session so that we can deliver this session to many people as possible. So we probably will wait for 2 more minutes. And also for this session, I just want to remind you guys, we probably will divide into 3 sections. The first part, we will let 3 of our speakers to talk a little bit about their presentation on a specific aspect of the Canadian legal market. And later on, I will also ask them 3 to 4 questions asked by some of you guys. Those are some of the most popular questions asked. And later on, we will open up for you guys to actually ask as many questions as possible as well. So don't worry if you have questions, but we didn't address it at the first half of the session, because we will later on talk about it in a later session as well. And also a reminder for you guys as well, if you just enter into this webinar, please mute your mic, and also you can open up your video if you want to participate in this session, but do mute your mic so that all the people can just listen to the speakers, what they're talking about, rather than having some noises, background noises, which might interrupt the whole session. Yeah, let's probably wait like a minute. Yeah, I think right now we almost have 70 people, which is quite impressive. And probably we should have, get started. And yeah, so again, welcome to those who just entered into this webinar session. And today we have 3 amazing people joining us from the Canadian legal market, talking about this topic that is very special, and you can rarely find webinars like this, I think, in on the internet or online or for any kind of law firms. So I think it's good for you to actually know about. So today I will just let our speakers to briefly introduce themselves before we start these sessions. Basically, this session is co-organized by Global Lawyers Connect and Global Lawyers of Canada. And 2 of our speakers are from Global Lawyers of Canada, so that they will talk more about this organization as well in their introduction session. So I'll leave it to you first, Daniel, to introduce yourself, and later on the other 2 speakers, Siobhan and Sarah, as well.
Sure. Thanks, Gordon. And hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us here. And thank you once again, Gordon, for kind of co-organizing this with us. Fantastic platform, Global Lawyers Connect. I'm sure you guys all know. But we're actually representing, Siobhan and I represent Global Lawyers of Canada. So very briefly, I am one of the co-founders of Global Lawyers of Canada, and we were founded in 2015. We are a professional association that advocates and supports internationally trained lawyers in Canada. And we started in 2015 with 1 chapter in Calgary with maybe 20 active members. And half of that was actually the board, so it doesn't really count. But now, actually 5 years onwards, we're a national platform with chapters in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, recently Saskatchewan, and soon the Atlantic provinces as well. So we've come a long way, and we're very proud of where the organization is headed to. And we've also partnered with almost every major law firm in Canada on events and sponsorship. So we're very proud of that, and we have that kind of national kind of law firm reach. So we've worked really hard on that as well. And personally, about myself, I am a private equity lawyer. I'm based in Singapore, and I'm qualified in the provinces of Alberta and Ontario. England and Wales, and the British Virgin Islands. Now, today, I started a new role as legal counsel for UBS here in Singapore within its asset management business, which involves the management of investment funds. And prior to UBS, I worked at Walker's, which is an offshore law firm, also doing investment funds and direct private equity investments. And prior to Singapore, I was in Hong Kong. I spent 2 years there at a private equity firm as in-house counsel. And prior to that, I was in Canada, specifically Calgary, where I completed my articling, which is the equivalent of a training contract. And I practiced 1 year at Denton's as a corporate lawyer. So in a nutshell, that's who I am, and that's what GLC Canada represents. So I guess I'll pass it on to Siobhan.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Siobhan. I'm originally from the UK. I did a non-law undergraduate degree. Then I worked for a year in industry before doing the GDL program. I was successfully obtained a training contract position with a top 50 UK law firm who sponsored me to do the LPC at BPP. I completed my training contract and boom, 2009. So we all know what happened in 2009. Corporate lawyers were not being hired. So I took a brief career gap that turned into a total relocation to Canada. And then I started the permanent residency process, the NCA process, which is how you become qualified in Canada, which we're going to go into in a little bit for you. Obtained articles, completed the articling process here in British Columbia, and I've been an associate here for the last almost 2 years now. I practice in cross-border securities, M&A, and corporate work, typically in the emerging and junior market sector. So that's me in a nutshell. And over to Sahil.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's good morning here in Canada. It's 9 o'clock in Ontario, Toronto. For everybody on video and joining in, I'm a 6th year associate with Gowling WLG. My practice is litigation and arbitration focused. So people in the UK, I specifically just do barrister work. I do not do anything that Daniel does or Siobhan does. I never draft any contracts. I litigate those contracts when things go wrong or it's not what people expected. My practice is focused on energy disputes, construction infrastructure disputes. I do highways, hospitals, pipelines, and nuclear power projects. So very specific, and a lot of international arbitrations and a lot of times in courts. Now I'm doing virtual quotes. I just appear from my dining table talking to judges and lawyers on the other side. I went to law school in England. I started in 2010, almost 10 years ago. I came back to Canada in 2012. I articled with a smaller boutique firm, and then I'm now finishing up my year 6 with Gowling WLG Canada. Yeah, I'm looking forward to answering your questions, and really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of the 3 speakers introducing themselves. And yeah, probably we would gonna start the presentation session where each of the speakers will talk, maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes each to talk about specific aspect of the Canadian legal market. And also one thing I want to remind you guys is also that this session will be recorded. So feel free, if you don't want to show your video, just feel free to type your questions on the chat box as well, and we will look at it and just raise the question to the speakers later on during this session as well. So I will pass it to our speakers to start their presentation. Siobhan, you want to start first, or Daniel?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you will all be able to see it in 1 second. So if you want to give me a thumbs up that you can actually read this. Perfect, excellent. Okay, so I made this fancy presentation and I don't actually know how to use PowerPoint without my assistant, so bear with me. So there are 3 stages to the NCA process, which is how you can turn your internationally trained qualifications into practicing in Canada. There is stage 1, the NCA assessment process. Stage 2, the articling process, which for those of you who are familiar with the UK, that's the training contract equivalent. And then stage 3, which is the provincial bar requirements. Now, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Canada, we are made up of a whole bunch of provinces and territories. Every province and territory has their own set of rules and regulations around the licensing of lawyers and paralegals. So you do need to check their individual websites to find out what their rules are. There's not one blanket one. So it's kind of similar to the States, where every state is different. So with the NCA assessment process, it's managed by the Federation of Law Societies, which is basically all of the law societies of all the different provinces and territories. And they set up a group called the NCA, the National Committee on Accreditation. They manage the process of everybody being licensed, basically, and making sure we're all equivalent, we've all got the right credentials, and we're not going to do any detriment to the general public by providing legal advice and services. There's various different rules and regulations. I'll send you this presentation afterwards so you can all read it in your own time. There are 6 steps to the NCA process. The first step is a self-assessment process. You can now go to the website, which is NCA Legal. And on that website, it has a very handy little chart, which we didn't know existed before. And you basically just click on the little quiz questions with your experiences. So where your internationally trained experience is from, what level you're at, whether you were taught by distance learning or in-person learning, and then it will give you a sort of a guideline of what your process may look like for you individually, because it is very a tailored process for each individual. Once you've done the self-assessment process, you can then submit all of your paperwork. The NCA Legal website sets everything out that you need, but basically you need to contact all of your universities, all of the bar associations that you're members of, get them to submit transcripts and copies of your certificates directly to the NCA. They cannot come to you. They need to go directly to the NCA. They'll reject them otherwise, so don't waste the time and money that it takes to do it. Once all of your paperwork is in, they review all of the application for you, and then they come back and they tell you what you need to do. So which subjects you need to meet, which requirements you need, which deficiencies you have. As an absolute basic minimum, they're going to assess you that you need to do 5 core subjects. The 5 core subjects are listed out on the slide. Those can be taken in a number of different ways. You can either self-study and challenge the exams. The exams are done on a schedule of the 5 core ones are done 4 times a year. If you're assessed to do additional subjects, they're staggered throughout the year, normally 2 sessions per year for each subject. Or you can go to a Canadian university and try and take the exams there. But if you're just doing one-off exams, it's if the universities have space for an additional person to come in and do those exams. That's quite rare. Or you could do an LLM program, or you could sign up and do a full JD program. If you're coming from a civil law jurisdiction, you are more than likely going to have to do a university accredited course, so an LLM or a JD. If you're coming from a common law jurisdiction, probably unlikely that you're going to have to do that. There are people out there on the internet who are offering tutorial packages to assist you with this, with doing these exams. A word of caution for all of you, you're all lawyers, potential lawyers, do your due diligence. You don't need to use these services. You can self-study. They provide you all of the information that you need. So take it as that. Once you've completed all of the exams, and you've met all of the requirements, then the NCA will then issue a certificate of qualification. This is what you need to present to the law society of whichever province or territory you decide you want to be based in. You'll fill in all the application forms in terms of them, and then you got to look for articling. And you need to do articling. Articling is in 2 stages for nearly every single province and territory. It's an 8 to 10 month practical on the job process, and also the bar exams themselves. Now, every province is slightly different. The requirements are slightly different, so you do need to check all the individual provinces. For example, in Ontario, you can take the bar exams before you have an articling position. In BC, you cannot even apply to do the bar exams until you have an articling position lined up and you've signed a contract with a law firm to do it. So they're very different processes. The exams all used to be in person. Now, with COVID, things are starting to move online for some of the provinces and territories. So that gives it a little bit more flexibility. The same with the NCA. August will be the first time that those exams have been offered online. Once you've done the bar exams and you've done your articling process, then you become a member of the bar, and welcome to Canada and the Canadian legal system on that one. There you go, fancy presentation over. We will circulate that afterwards. I'm going to hand over to Sahil next.
Sure, thank you, Siobhan. So I'm going to focus on my experience. I'm a lawyer in Ontario, whereas Siobhan is a lawyer called to the bar in British Columbia. Like Siobhan mentioned, yes, you can apply to write the bar exams before you even have an articling position, which is certainly a case in Ontario. Personally, for me, I was asked to write 7 exams because I did my undergraduate degree here in Canada, then went to the UK to do my law degree for 2 years, came back and was asked to do 7 exams. I believe I came back in June of 2012. I wrote all my 7 exams in October of 2012. And then I got my results in January of 2013. I wrote my bar exam in June of 2013 and started my articles in July of 2013 and got called to the bar in June of 2014. For me personally, I had submitted my application well in advance of graduating from law school to the NCA. So the only item that was missing was my transcript, or my final transcript from the law school. So I had my application number. So that helped me fast track, in a sense. By the time I had finished law school, I already had the application number, and it only took, I believe, less than 2 weeks for my applications to be finally assessed and for the exams to be assigned to me so that I can get started studying for those exams immediately. Writing 7 exams in 4 days was insane. I wrote 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon for 4 consecutive days. I had no idea what test I was writing, but it was very, very challenging. Back in 2012, I think the resources now in 2020 are far greater than what they were back in 2012. You were just simply, there was no self-assessment tool on NCA website. There was no online account. You applied and you waited by the post box for a letter to show up to tell you from NCA as to what was happening with your application, with your results, where were you going to go to write the exams. Because I was based in Ontario, I wrote my exams in Toronto at a very large center, and then waited for the course of 3 to 4 months for the results to show up. Again, in a snail mail, the result would come 1 letter at a time with at least 1 or 2 results. While I was waiting for all of this, it was the articling that was the hardest thing, at least for me personally, because I had went to the school in the UK and had not appreciated while I went to the school in the UK that the timing of things would not line up when I came home for summers or once I had come home from finishing law school, because a summer position in the law firm, I'm talking about a larger law firm, runs from typically, but for COVID-19, would run from May till August. Those would be the summer months. Whereas because I was in the school in the UK, we didn't finish school until June. So that means even though I had interest, I was not able to take up the offer because I would not fit those 4 months. So by the time you come back, I had not done a summer position. I did not have an articling position lined up. I applied all across Ontario for an articling position. I applied more than 1,000 applications. And NCA back in 2012 was not known. People had no idea what NCA was. How was somebody going to qualify? I hope things are different now, for better. But back then it was a foreign concept to larger firms, mid-sized firms, even smaller firms. I even though I had really good grades and all of that stuff, you still had to explain the grades to the Canadian employer. That was a challenge, and the school was helpful at the time, but I was not able to secure an articling position with a national or an international firm. I worked at a smaller boutique, and looking back, I think that was the best experience I would have ever gotten, because I was litigating disputes second day on the articling position with my articling principal. Like he said, I'm sitting here, let's talk about evidence issues. How are you going to exclude evidence? How are you going to exclude witnesses? So in hindsight, it would not have been any different. It was a great experience. So all that I'm trying to say is, like, even though Toronto is a very large legal market, there are great law firms, great articling principal outside of Toronto. Ontario is extremely big. You have communities up north that that are looking for articling positions, somebody who's going to come and help them because they do not get much interest. I was able to secure an articling position in Thunder Bay, Ontario. It was extremely cold. I showed up for my interview thinking I was well dressed. It was minus 48 the day I landed. It was brutal. It was February, I think. I went for my articling interview. I stayed on with the firm to get to know the area and everything else. What they did for a week, I shadowed my articling principal, and even though it was brutally cold, I was hooked. So even I had other offers, but I had to go back. So I did go back, and I articled, caught call to the bar, stayed on for another year and a half with that firm before deciding to move closer to family. And here I am 6-7 years later, litigating disputes on energy projects that I have no idea even existed, or nuclear projects. I never took construction law in school. Contract law was the only course that I took that I really use now, or the principles. But I had zero idea about construction infrastructure law, or even there were disputes on these projects. I was very naive. But all that to say, I knew that I wanted to be a litigator. I didn't want it to be a solicitor. So my articling term was exclusively focused just on litigation. All my rotations were only exclusive to litigation. I did not do a rotation in business or IP or any other seat. Because I had done a lot of mooting in law school and had really enjoyed it, I really, really wanted to focus my articling term, and all these years later, that's what I do for a living. And there are extremely good days, and then there are some challenging days where the witness didn't say what you expect them to say, or they said the things, or they gave you a surprise for the first time while giving evidence, but you learn to deal with it as things go on. But if I can give one message, it is, don't be disheartened by the amount of rejection you will get as an internationally trained lawyer. You would have to overcome that stigma. But once your foot is in the door and you've started to gain good experience, it is, what you bring to the table at the end of the day. Yes, getting an articling position with a national firm is great, as Daniel will speak to. But again, don't be disheartened if you don't secure one. Not all lawyers practice at large national, international firms. There are great lawyers who are at boutique or regional firms. So just to, broaden your articling outreach, if I can give you one message, is just be open. And I didn't have any commitment as to family, kids at the time, so I was a free bird to go anywhere by myself in 2 backpacks. I know those can be challenging if you have a family and kids that are moving to Canada with you, but certainly keep an open mind, and sky's the limit for you. Over to you, Daniel.
Thanks, Sahil. And actually, just to add to Sahil's, I articled and trained in Calgary, so I think we get just as cold, if not colder, than Thunder Bay. We get to -40, but that was dry cold. So you had it easy in Thunder Bay. But in terms of, no, I agree with Sahil in saying that, don't be restricted to national law firms or international law firms if the scope of work that you want to do is offered at every law firm, every range. But for me, I knew I always wanted to be a solicitor because I had, when I was young, going through university, I had an affinity for business and entrepreneurship. So for me, being a solicitor was 100% what I wanted to do. And I knew I also wanted a major law firm because the scope of the work that I do pursue, which is securities and M&A, the best work is at the international firms. For me, I have to shoot for the stars before I kind of land for anything, at the mid-tier kind of firm. But like Sahil, I applied across the country. I think I applied, hundreds of applications for articling in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, all the way to the Maritimes. And straight out of my LLM, I did not get any bites. I thought that having Canadian law degree finally on my CV would allow me to get more foot in the door, but it didn't. The one thing that did help me was actually doing a non-legal role at RBC Capital Markets. I was doing a contract negotiation kind of role for 2 years. And after 2 years at the firm, or at the investment bank, almost all national firms gave me an interview. So that was a stark difference from hundreds of rejections to finally some bites. But in terms of national law firm hiring, the process for all national law firms, generally it's based on province in terms of timeline. So when I was applying back in 2014 or so, it was Alberta first, and then the GTA, which does not include Toronto. GTA could include kind of the suburbs and whatnot, Mississauga, Thunder Bay, other kind of municipalities. But downtown Toronto is later after that. And then usually it's BC. And with Saskatchewan, Quebec, Maritimes, sometimes they advertise on this portal called the Desktop Portal, which is where major law firms, but also many other law firms advertise their roles. But sometimes they advertise on the websites. So we can distribute that website later on for you guys to check it out. But that's generally the case. And they do that because Toronto usually goes last because they know that they want those who are committed to Toronto. So if Alberta offers you an articling position, with an offer in hand, do you forego that offer and risk it in Toronto where the competition is higher, right? So it's a bit of a juggling game here to see where you are, where you want to be, and how committed you are. And when you go through the interview process, a key question that every major law firm asks you is, why here? So when I moved from Toronto, I'm originally from Toronto, Mississauga to be specific, and I moved to Calgary. The one question they asked without a doubt was, why Calgary? You have no family here, you have no friends, you don't know energy, because I was trying to go for the energy role. What makes you think you'll fit in here, basically, right? I'm sure the same thing goes for when you're in London as well, applying for London roles. Why London, right? But I think for Canada, because each province is so territorial, you really need to justify why you want to be in that city. So typically for national law firms, though, they hire from their articling students from their 1L or 2L summer students. So as Sahil was saying, the timeline-wise doesn't really work for UK students because we get off by June and July. They start their program in May. But alas, they do hire heavily from the 1L and 2L summer students. Sometimes they will have a need for articling students, but it would depend on the province. And my experience is that in BC and Alberta, they generally hire less articling students and more from their summer students. So I'm saying maybe at one firm that's 1 or 2. I know definitely for my intake of 12 students, I was the only articling student. So there weren't a lot. But in Toronto, there would be more. I think some of the major firms like Osler's, McCarthy's may hire 6 to 8 articling students that are not summer students. So I think Toronto is the better bet. But not to say that the other provinces don't have potential as well. And basically for every articling role, I think the odds are around 100 candidates that the law firm will consider. So, it's pretty competitive, but I think that's competitive across the board in Canada and also in the UK as well.
We were told on Thursday that's increased, and
increased. Okay.
a mid-sized
okay.
firm in Calgary who recently had, in Saskatchewan. Was it? No, a national firm in Saskatchewan. They had 1 position available. They had over 360 applicants.
Well, there you go. Not to deter anyone. It just means you got to work harder. But what I'm trying to get across here is that national law firms actually strive for diversity. A lot of firms say that they try to do diversity and inclusion, but from my experience, national law firms do try, and they do strive for that, not in terms of ethnic makeup, but also background. So for example, in my articling class of 12, we've had a farm ranch cowboy, we had a lifestyle journalist, an oil and gas engineer, and a varsity softball player. So you can tell that, personal branding for me, I'm a big advocate for personal branding, but it's very important because it helps you convey your unique narrative. And I think actually legal experience is not everything. Once again, from my experience, non-legal background is actually sometimes more compelling. And it just makes you stand out more than the usual, like you did a summer back scheme and this and that. I do think if you have something special about you, to really amplify that in your applications, because it will, these firms will pick up on that.
Yeah, just on one point about national law firms, as you spend more time there, you see, the people that I started with, as I'm finishing my year 6, I think there's only one other person that's left with me. So while it's great to, it's great work, it comes with its own challenges and work-life balance and other things. And it's really what you want out of your career. So, there was about 30 or so that started. I think there's 2 of us left. So just to be mindful of that yes, having a national brand on your CV at the start is helpful, but it's not for everybody in the long run, and it's really what you want out of your career. A lot of people that I worked with originally have moved down in-house, like get somebody at a bank doing cool stuff that I have no idea about. And others have gone to do, work with the government or smaller shops, or wanted, to raise kids in a smaller community. So just giving you some perspective that yes, having national firms like Denton's, Gowling's, Baker McKenzie, Osler is great. You do lose a lot of people over here. Just that comment.
And also the national firms are typically business focused. So they act for companies in various different practice areas. So if you want to work in, say, family law or something that's related to individuals, so private client work, you're probably not going to go to an international firm because they won't have that big of a private client department.
Yeah, and actually to further on that, that's a great point, because of my class of 12, I think there's maybe only 2 that are still left in my class. Many people actually left to either go in-house to other firms, but also to kind of other roles like a business role. So the farm ranch cowboy guy I told you about, he's gone back into the industry, the agricultural industry, and he's doing fantastic work. And also I know another articling student that went to, after articling, became a politician, pivoted in that sense. So, the law firms, national law firms are great as a marketing tool. Use it as such and pivot it wherever way you want, basically. Not everyone makes it a partner. And I would say, it's becoming harder now, right? Because you got to build a book, it's a business case, but use it wisely in terms of what your goal is, say, in the 3 and 5 year kind of milestone.
So I've just got one more comment about Ontario. While we were focusing on articling, Ontario has now, in the last couple of years, has also implemented, another program called LPP, which is offered by Ryerson and University of Ottawa if you want to take a French course. That is an alternative to articling. It is in-person and virtual training that you get. A lot of the times, I have personally worked with an LPP candidate, and he was phenomenal. He graduated top of his class at a Canadian law school, was still unable to find an articling position, and I was shocked when he showed up to do his article LPP placement, and the quality of work was phenomenal. So that is something open to Ontario candidates as well. If you're applying to the Law Society of Ontario and that's where you want to settle. So that's an alternative to doing an articling altogether.
Great. I think, Gordon, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for our three speakers. They probably give a really good insight about different aspects of the Canadian legal market. So before we jump to the questions asked by yourself live, we will probably also ask our speakers to answer three most commonly asked questions based on the submission of question we got in the registration form. And first of all, because most of the audience, they're coming from a more international background, there's always this one question about how could they overcome the hurdle of stigma around non-Canadian lawyers or international students? Because some people actually mentioned that they were worried that whether getting your degree converted or completing articles actually help in terms of because of their international background, and also given that they're not Canadian trained or educated lawyer. What do you guys think? Like any of you can comment or answer this question would be great.
Daniel, do you want to have a go at this first?
Sure. So we've spoken about the stigma about an internationally trained lawyer, and I think that's rooted in the Canadian legal industry being quite conservative and protectionist compared to, say, other jurisdictions like the UK and Australia and whatnot. There is a view, right, I think wrong, but foreign law degrees are not up to par with Canadian law degree. I think that's merely just misinformation. But because Canadian law schools pump out so many law students, I don't think there is motivation for employers back in Canada to kind of understand the different jurisdictions and whatnot. But having said that, it is getting better. I think from when I articled back in 2014, barely anyone knew about the NCA. But now I think there's many organizations like Global Lawyers of Canada, there's another one called NCA Network and whatnot, that have been advocating for internationally trained lawyers. But I think for me, two things that you could do to combat stigma if you're an internationally trained lawyer is get some Canadian work experience. So it doesn't have to be relevant, it doesn't have to be legal, but I say just Canadian work experience, preferably in the field that you want to get into. So if you want to get into insurance litigation, maybe it'd be helpful if you worked in an insurance company or something related to that, right? But at the end of the day, I think Canadian employers feel comfortable once they see, say, like a Canadian bank on your resume to show that another employer has vetted you and you're somewhat competent. Another option you can consider, and I don't think this is for everyone, but it is a Canadian LLM. So I think I think we can talk about that later, but Siobhan, Sahil, stigma?
Yeah, I mean, Sahil touched on this a little bit earlier about the change he's seen from the time that he came back to Canada from the UK. And it is changing. But one of the things with Canada is, and if you compare it to London, New York, Southeast Asia, Canada is a very internal market in terms of its legal services. It predominantly serves its homegrown and internal businesses. It doesn't do as much international work as some of the hubs like London, New York, Asia. So the international experience you're bringing isn't as relevant to as many firms here because they're not doing international work. So for them, it's one of those, that's nice, you've got some experience. but what are you going to bring me here in Canada? What can you add value to my firm, to our clients? And that's where Daniel's tip of getting some work experience is so important. I mean, they're looking at articling students, and by them I mean the Canadian law firms, and they're expecting their articling students to have had a job as a server, which is like a waitress, someone who worked in a restaurant. They want you to have had some form of employment in Canada, because they want to know that you are committed to living here and being part of the community. So it doesn't really matter too much what it is, but you need to show you actually want to be part of this community and that you're going to stick around, because you're a bit of a flight risk on that one. And then it's a matter of accepting that you're going to have to explain a little bit more about you and what that means. Because if they're faced with two candidates and one of them, they went to University of Toronto or University of Calgary or UBC, which are 3 Canadian universities across the country, that's a known quantity. They know what that is. They're like, okay, they went here, they did that, boom. And then they see one of our resumes where it's from somewhere they've never heard of and they don't know what it means. They spend about 20 seconds looking at each application. So, you know, you need to put it in there. So you should get your qualifications assessed. There's lots and lots of websites you can do this on where they'll turn it into a Canadian equivalent. So they'll explain what a 2-1 means in terms of a Canadian 1. So you should do that and include it and explain it in your cover letter.
I've got 2 points just on Daniel's and Siobhan's. One is, you know, don't hesitate to reach out to people. I find people at least reaching out to me and my colleagues and people that I know who've been through this journey. Here we are this morning talking to complete strangers we have never met in person. Don't hesitate to reach out, and if you see an opportunity at an organization, just get an understanding as to how things are done. What is the role about? You know, get an understanding of, you know, how the rotations would work. If you are going to do an article, can the person that you're speaking to put you in touch with the director for student programs so that you can get your questions answered, whatever questions you may have, and input those questions into a cover letter to show your interest in the organization that you're applying to as an outsider, number one. Number two, you know, Siobhan mentioned this. Yes, Canadian market is quite internal, but it also depends on your practice area. For example, if you do international arbitration, there's not a lot that is done in Canada. And if you have experience doing, you know, disputes in ICC or other arbitration rules, people are going to be interested to look at your profile and to see what kind of disputes that you worked on. For example, if you're coming from Middle East, from London or anywhere else, and you have, you know, background in an area that you're applying to, there could be an interest. And, you know, reach out to young associates in that practice area. Diverse firms, both national and, you know, other regional firms where that practice area is being considered and people practice in that area, to get a sense of, you know, what kind of cases are they working on? Are they working on, you know, energy disputes or other disputes involving other jurisdictions? And make reference to that in your application. A lot of the time, you know, depending on your experience, and I know this firsthand, for example, my colleague at Gowlings, he was a lawyer in Ireland. When he applied to Law Society in Ontario, his articling was completely waived because he had all of the experience in order to qualify in Ontario. And he got extremely lucky because, again, through networking, he was get his foot into Gowlings, 2 weeks after he arrived in Ireland, in Toronto from Ireland, as a consultant, while he went through NCA and all that stuff, because, you know, his CV was very well put together and he had great experience working for the very big name in Dublin. And he used his network to his advantage. He knew somebody at Gowlings in London who vetted for him to Gowlings in Toronto. And, it's a small world. And before you know it, he met the managing partners and others for a coffee and had a opportunity to join as a consultant while he went through the process. Again, not many people have been able to do that, but certainly if you have an experience, showcase that in your cover letter, because that's your prime opportunity. And don't hesitate to reach out to people to speak on the phone, or coffees are getting challenging in the COVID-19 environment. But I think LinkedIn is a great tool. It was not as a great tool in 2012 to connect with people. So I'll leave it there. Over to you, Gordon.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think you guys really explain it in great details about the stigma around non-Canadian lawyers. I think the next question is also kind of relevant to this, because usually it's probably true for any kind of jurisdiction. Whenever international students or foreigners want to get into another jurisdiction, they tend to take the LLM. So what's the value of a Canadian LLM in the Canadian legal market for foreigners? Would it kind of increase their chances here, or help them in any small way by actually doing an LLM? Can you guys maybe shed some light on this particular question, which is a very interesting question, asked by so many of our audience as well?
Yeah. Now, I had a very different answer to what I'm going to give you until we did our virtual mentoring hours on this last Thursday, where I spoke to the Director of Legal Talent for the largest law firm in Canada, and also a partner and student recruitment committee member for a regional law firm. And there's two things here to keep in mind. If you're coming from a civil law jurisdiction, then an LLM is probably your best route, because you need to be common law qualified. So that's one caveat. But if you're coming from a common law jurisdiction, what these two individuals said to us during our virtual mentor office hours on Thursday was, it's nice to have. It's not a requirement, but it's nice to have. However, if you're going to be wanting to work in a particular area of law, say tax or intellectual property, then it may be advantageous for you to do one. But generally, it's just a nice to have. And if you have two candidates who have exactly the same experience on paper, and one has an LLM and one doesn't, then it might be an advantage to you.
Yeah, Siobhan, I would actually add to that. I completely agree. Specialization, say in a particular area such as international tax law, would be advantageous. I think there are three other considerations I'd say for an LLM. It's if you say want to pivot into a new practice area. So, I mean, if you are a qualified lawyer in a jurisdiction and you're practicing in litigation and you want to jump onto solicitor side, you may want to consider a LLM in IP if that's what you want to be. But it would help to kind of bridge that gap between barrister and solicitor. Another thing the LLM is good for is obviously academia. If you want to pursue your doctorate in law, an LLM is mandatory. And lastly, I think this last point appeals to myself and also many others, I think, is to practice in a new country that is not the jurisdiction of your law degree or your legal qualification. So, doing an American LLM if you want to work in the States. Some American LLMs allow you to write the bar after you do the LLM. So I think that, once again, though, it is a marketing tactic. It is not necessary, it's not requirement. It is a pricey one as well. Some of these LLMs go, $20,000, $30,000. They're not cheap. But at the end of the day, you do what you will with it. If you think that you'll get bang for your buck from the LLM, go for it. But I would generally stick to those kind of 4 criteria on why you want to do the LLM.
Just on that note, thank you both, Siobhan and Daniel. I personally did not do an LLM. And I know a lot of NCA candidates who I have had an opportunity to work with over my career, both with and against at large national firms, none of them who had done LLMs. And again, back in 2012, LLM in common law that you can now do did not exist. I think UBC had just started that year. So this was all, was just getting started as I was going through the process. But all that to say, I only know one person who's a tax lawyer who went to school with me at Leicester, who did an LLM in tax because that's what he wanted to do. Again, it didn't come with an articling position at the end. He still had to go through all of the hurdles to get an articling position at a tax law firm. In fact, his marketability was a lot more narrower because he wanted to be a tax lawyer so that he can get an articling position at a tax law firm. So his pool of law firms was extremely small. He had to relocate from Toronto to Calgary to find an articling position. He has now relocated back to Toronto. But all that to say, NC is is a lot more cheaper than doing an LLM. And you have to be true to yourself as to what are you going to get at the end of the day. I'm not sure if doing an LLM give you access to the resources at the law school that you're doing an LLM, same as what people who are doing a JD would get to. I don't know, Daniel, if that's the case, but don't invest in it without really knowing what you want out of it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I would add that there is a distinguishing feature between the common law LLMs that are advertised to allow you to complete the NCA process, and fantastic option, actually a necessary option for those with a civil law background, right? But those coming from a common law background to the UK, you should consider whether that will be beneficial for you, or like Sahil was saying, you can complete the NCA exams on your own. Completely up to you. I personally did my LLM at the University of Toronto. And for me, the two things of the four criteria that I mentioned. One, it's the practice in a new country. That's not jurisdiction of my law degree. So Canada, although being from Canada, I do not have a law degree from Canada. So for me, it was a marketing kind of a technique. The second thing is I do later on want to teach. So I think setting myself up for an SJD later on, it's beneficial for me to get the studying out of the way at this point. So once again, do due diligence, see what the LLM is good for, and if you actually necessarily need it later on. If there are better ways to market yourself, like getting a relevant job or getting a commercial role, that might be a better use of your time than to do an LLM and spend more money and more studying time, which I'm sure you guys are tired of studying at this point.
Yeah, I didn't do an LLM either. I just did the NCA exams, but I was also working for a national law firm as a legal assistant whilst doing my NCA exams. So I was gaining Canadian work experience, and I was working within the team that in the department I was ultimately going to work in.
Just on that note, one of our articling students who's going to start with us in August went to the school in the UK and was a legal assistant for a couple of years. She went through the NCA process and was asked to come back to the firm to article. So that's an option that, again, I had no idea even existed 8 years ago, but I think people are getting a lot more clever as time is passing. So there's an example that I have seen live in front of me.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing more and more of that. I know for the firm that I worked for a national law firm as a legal assistant, and at the time they didn't take anybody as an articling student who hadn't done a summer program. That has since changed, and I now know of at least 5 internationally trained lawyers who worked as legal assistants with them and are now articling with them or about to start articling with them across the country. So things are definitely changing and have changed in the last few years.
Yeah, thank you, you guys. Actually, I personally think that this advice on LLM is actually pretty much applicable to even other countries as well. Like having myself also did my LLM in the UK. I just feel like it's really good general advice, even for people not considering like about LLM in Canada, but just in general, you need to make a very personal decision on whether this is actually beneficial to you, because it's a costly option for sure. And I think the last question we're gonna talk about before going to the live question from audiences. Some people wonder whether there is any differences between the different geographic areas in Canada in terms of the practice area strengths, and maybe some areas they may be more famous for certain practice areas. If people they may have a specific interest in a specific area, which jurisdiction or places they may want to choose to practice. What do you guys think about this?
Yes, there is, to some degree. Obviously, every province will have private client work. You'll have real estate, property law, you'll have general business law requirements, but there are pockets of specialisms. So, for example, Sahil works in international arbitration. That's pretty much done out of Toronto. Most international corporations and large corporations will have their headquarters in Toronto. The financial sector is pretty much based in Toronto. There are regional offices around the country, but the head offices tend to be there, so they'll have their largest in-house legal teams in and around Ontario. Alberta is famously known for its oil and gas industry. BC is typically known for its natural resources, but it's also becoming a tech corridor based down the Pacific Northwest. So through Washington State, down into Oregon, and then down into California. So there's more and more of that opening up. Yeah, so there is that to keep in mind.
I would also add that Alberta is definitely oil and gas traditionally, but in the past few years, because of the multitude of oil crashes, the province has seen an uptick in the need to diversify. So Calgary, for instance, is pushing to become a tech hub, to be the tech hub of Western Canada. And actually, since the legalization of cannabis, I think Calgary and Edmonton, both cities have been vying to build that industry out in terms of medical marijuana and cultivation and production. So there are kind of niche areas that each province is kind of specializing and trying to build a specialty for.
Yeah, I would agree with both Siobhan and Daniel in terms of the practice areas. I know, at least from Gowings itself, that Vancouver is really heavy in Indigenous law and some of the other things in that practice space. Litigation arbitration, I work on projects across the country. I've done projects in BC, in Vancouver, Victoria, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, Labrador, Halifax, and of course Toronto. So having a license in one jurisdiction, you can also get 100 days that you can practice in another province rather than getting called to the bar in that province. So that definitely helps. But at the end of the day, like I think it was Siobhan that mentioned that if you want to be a family lawyer, you can practice family law anywhere in the country. If you want to be a real estate lawyer doing either, residential real estate or commercial real estate, you can do that anywhere. Litigation can be done anywhere. It just depends, what kind of litigation you want to do. You want to do the litigation where the cross-examination questions that you ask becomes the headline at Globe and Mail, or do you want to do, personal injury litigation? It's personal preference. Do you want to do litigation where there's also crisis management, COVID-19 and others? Like I said, the advice that you're giving, you're seeing that on CBC at 1 o'clock when the Premier or Prime Minister is giving, the daily update. It just depends what kind of practice do you want, and that's really it. Just being true to yourself, and you're in this for a long haul. It's not a sprint, but a marathon. So you got to be true to yourself. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you all of our speakers for that answer. I think it definitely helps them clarify on that issue. And I think right now probably is about the time for us to jump to the live Q&A session as well. If the speakers agree, I think maybe we could spend 15 to 20 minutes because although the session is already an hour, but like for the sake of helping some of the audience. And before I actually jump to the chat box, I just wonder whether any of the audience would like to maybe even speak up and ask the question live, because I also kind of want to have the interactive aspect of this Zoom meeting. If anyone actually wants to do that, otherwise I would definitely more than willing to just go through the chat box. Just anyone, if they want to ask any question, just start their video or speak up. That would be well.
If Rosa is still available, Rosa, you had a question quite early.
Yeah, I did. I actually have a second question to my first one. The first question I asked was, I go to a English law school where it's an accelerated 2-year program, and we only get a couple weeks off at the end of each semester. And if I work, and I do work placements at, for instance, Gowlings in London, or for large international firms that do have offices in Canada, are those considered when, or are they beneficial when you're applying for articling positions or not?
I can speak to that because I've seen that happen. Certainly, if you're working for a partner, say in Gowling's London office in the UK, and when you're applying to an articling position or a summer position back in Toronto, I would highly recommend that you showcase your experience and get the partner to write you a letter or something that you can include as part of your application to the law firm, so that they know that you've worked with this brand internationally, and firms, as they're becoming more international, they want to as Danielle mentioned, want to diversify and have that diverse talent pool. And if you're breaking in from a London market to a Canadian market with the same brand on your CV, definitely showcase it. It all depends who in the committee is going to have your CV at the end of the day, who's going to look at it for 20 to 30 seconds while having a sandwich in one end and a cup of coffee in the other, and somebody at the door.
But I guess it also comes down to personal marketing, like you said, because obviously for a firm like Gowlings, if they have an Ottawa office, that's going to be very specific work to Ottawa versus the one in London. So you would still have to do a lot of sort of marketing. Because I was told that international work wasn't really beneficial because of the protectionist sort of idea of law firms.
No, certainly, but again, irrespective of what you're told, how are you going to take that opportunity and make that beneficial for yourself is how I would take it, and use that in the cover letter. You're going to be told a lot of different things. Don't worry about it, or don't highlight it. How are you going to make sure that you stand out from thousands of applications that Toronto or Ottawa is going to get? How are you going to use that experience to your best advantage and to stand out? And if you're working in Gowlings London, get a London partner to ring the director of recruitment and vouch for you.
Okay.
Make those connections, and it's all about I think if that's the case, again, Baker McKenzie has a London office. There's a Toronto office at Baker McKenzie. I speak to my London colleagues and Birmingham colleagues quite a bit on large international projects. If I ask them, tell me about Siobhan, or says on her CV that she works with you, I'm sure he or she's not going to hesitate to tell me what a great student Siobhan is, and how. So that would be my recommendation. I don't know what Danielle, Siobhan, you think.
I think this brings us to a really nice segue into networking and how to use your network to your advantage. So Daniel mentioned earlier about building your brand and how to leverage the brand that you're building for the future. But also it's about using your network, and your network is currently around you. It's people you've met, it's people you're connecting with on LinkedIn. It's the four of us today. We're now part of your network. So it's about leveraging that network to connect you with other people, because 70% of positions are never advertised. And that's not just articling positions, that's jobs in general. They're not advertised. It's done by word of mouth and personal recommendations. So if you're not tapping into your network of people who can introduce you to somebody, so that 5 degrees of separation or 3 degrees of separation or whatever it's called, it's so important to use that and start developing that as you can. So if you are working somewhere with a firm that has a connection to a Canadian firm, use it to your advantage. What's the worst that happens? They say no. We're going to hear a lot of no's and a lot of rejections in life. But if you haven't at least tried to use those, you'll always be like, well, what if I did? Because that could be the door that opens it for a conversation, as Sahil says. So.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned that about my colleagues, a colleague who I currently work with, who had no connection to Gowlings, who had simply a partner from Dublin contact his contact at London to contact a contact in Toronto. It worked for him. He showed up and got a consultant position doing the work as a lawyer, typically, even though under somebody's supervision, again, through just word of mouth. He didn't apply through mountain of applications. I have never heard of somebody landing in a foreign jurisdiction on a work visa and working at a large international firm. Again, how do you use your network and your connections to your advantage?
And can I ask one more question? Quebec hasn't been spoken about, and I do have a friend that is at law school with me. He can't attend the webinar today, but he had a question because he wasn't sure whether to break into the Ontario or Quebec market. How would you go about transitioning into the Quebec market if it's based in civil law jurisdiction? I'm assuming it's the LLM route you would have to take.
The best thing to do, because none of us are civil law called, is not to try and dodge your question, but we don't want to give you incorrect information, is that if you go to the NCA legal website, there is actually a bit about if you want to go into Quebec. It is a completely different process. So it's not as simple as just transferring from one to the other. I had a colleague when I was working at the national firm who was called in Ottawa, and then he transferred, because we had an Ottawa office, he transferred to the Vancouver office. He had to do the NCA process. So I would recommend you go and look at the NCA legal website. It does actually set out all of the rules and regulations for the civil law.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question from Rosa as well. And I think there are also two people raised their hands. Probably they want to ask through the video, to ask the questions. And I think, yeah, you guys can probably start asking it if you want. Vishakan, I think. Yeah, probably go on if you want to ask question.
Yeah, so I'm in my final year. I'm yet to complete. It's because of the COVID. I've not yet completed my course. So I have this doubt. So if I'm planning on applying for the NCA assessment, so is it better if I do NCA courses and then finish all these mandatory subjects, or should I read the NCA, all these subjects on my own, and then do an LLM and then apply for the articling question and for the bar exam?
Yeah, any of you guys think you want to answer this part of the question, or you think you can help with?
I mean, the first thing you're going to have to do is complete your legal qualifications in your home jurisdiction, and then you're going to have to be assessed to work out what criteria you personally need to meet. I did put a link in the chat box to the NCA legal website where you can do that, and then depending on what they determine, really then it's up to you to decide if you want to meet those requirements. You can meet some of the NCA requirements through an LLM program. However, you would need to make sure with the NCA board that the individual courses, so the individual subjects within the LLM are going to meet the NCA requirements. Not all LLMs meet NCA requirements, and then you still have to do the NCA exams. But we're not able to tell you what your exact scenario is going to be because it's different for every single person. But the NCA legal website does give you a really good idea now. It never used to. Definitely not when I started. The website has had a complete overhaul, having just looked at it now. So I would definitely look at that and see what it recommends for you. And then it's up to you, similar to what we talked about with the LLM earlier. It's a very personal decision based on what you want your career to look like and what process you're doing. So I would consider that at that point. So hopefully that helps.
All right, yeah, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you for the question as well. And I think there's one other person also raised the hand. You could definitely ask question. I think it's Swata, if I pronounce it correct.
I got it.
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to ask. Yeah.
My question was relating to Sahil's example of one of your friends who moved from the UK and was working as a consultant. And I'm a qualified attorney in India. I worked there for 5 years, moved to the US, have been practiced here for 5 years, in corporate M&A. And I'm looking at potentially moving to Canada. in not so distant future. So initially, somebody suggested to me that looking at getting registered as a foreign legal consultant, and I think that was the example that you were giving about your friend. So my question was that if does any of you have any information in terms of, have you seen other people working as foreign consultant on their own? Because Law Society of Ontario actually says that if you have relevant experience and with registration, you can serve the clients in the, so for example, if I have clients in the US, I can move to I can move to Canada, get registered as a foreign consultant, and serve my clients in the US, not in Canada, of course. Do you have any information
Yeah,
on that? Or do you think?
I'm happy to speak to that question. So my colleague, he was not working on his own. He was working under the supervision of the partners that he worked with. He did not advise clients directly. Somebody had to vet his work when I went out, and he did that during his journey as NCA. And
Okay.
when he went through that journey and he applied to Law Society, because he had worked back in his home jurisdiction of Dublin for quite a period of time, doing high quality work, his articling was waived. But I personally do not have experience where somebody's registered on their own to do work for their own clients who are based somewhere else, but you're in Canada.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my experience, and knowing firsthand what somebody that I work with went through.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And I asked because I've been looking through the website, and that actually does say that there is an option, but I don't know if it's just on paper or that's even feasible. But like from my standpoint, the thought was again to like kind of bridge the gap that, you know, from the time you enter to the time you actually qualify to sit for the bar in Canada. Maybe you can utilize that time and continue to engage with your existing clients and work with them.
Okay, no, thank you for tuning in.
Yeah,
Thank
you could do it. I would be very concerned, though, at your risk of liability of potentially being exposed to giving legal advice that you are not covered for by being in a different country. So it's something that you should probably call the Law Society and ask for more guidance on, because they will be able to give that for you on that one.
Right, definitely, because I think there has to be reciprocity from both sides. So it has to be okayed by the bar in the US, and it has to be okayed by the bar in Canada.
Yeah,
for sure.
Thank you so much for the question as well. And let's move on to the next one. And I think there's one more hands raised by Richard. You can also ask your question if you are still want to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I'm audible. Yeah. So basically, I want to ask, like, after completing the NCA qualification, as per the panelists, whether an individual should enroll in a prep program, say for university in Alberta, or like LPP program in Ontario, or the other option will be that one should apply for articling position from one home country, and if we get that position, only then he will come to Canada. So my question is, LPP program is sort of a substitute to articulate position. So what would you recommend in these two?
Sorry, so you're asking, would we recommend you do like the LLP program?
Yeah, like the Yeah.
Okay, so the LPP program. So the LPP program is only in Ontario. So if you want to be called in Ontario, then it's definitely worth considering. I personally didn't do it. Sahil didn't do it. So we can only give you secondhand experience of what, you know, Sahil's actually worked with somebody who's done the LPP program, and I've spoken to people who are doing it and have done it. But I think it comes down to your personal situation. I have been told it's very, very intense. So it's up to you. It's similar kind of like with the LLM in terms of advice. It's a very personal decision, but there isn't a similar program elsewhere in Canada. definitely
Yeah,
not.
while it comes down, just on that point, while it comes down to your personal circumstances, I don't know if LPP is going to require you to be in Canada, because they do have in-person sessions as well, say how to run a trial or how to do a closing. And also because depending on where in the world you are located, I don't know if you need to be a permanent resident or have a student visa or a working visa in order to even enroll into Ryerson University's program. So that's something, again, for you to consider and look into. I would just contact Ryerson University directly and ask to, or email LPP department to see how would it actually play out.
Yeah.
I'm in there on the LPP because I'm registered to do the LPP, which begins now, and there are requirements in terms of, immigration laws and permits and those kind of things to complete to begin the LPP. And LPP does have 3 weeks of in-person, but due to COVID, they have decided to go completely online and virtual, even for the 3-week in-person sessions, which they previously used to have.
Yeah, thank you for the input from the audience, Sonia, as well. And I know you're also kind of relevant in this discussion. So thank you for that. And I think hopefully that will answer the audience question. And I think you need to go faster as well, because there are still people asking questions, and probably will limit to 1 question per person. So the next one, I think, is Jennifer. Jennifer, do you want to speak up and ask that question to the panel as well?
Yeah, great. Hello. So this question will probably only be answerable by Siobhan, seeing as you kind of went through the whole UK education system. But I'm sure, since with TCs in the UK, firms are so detail orientated in the sense that they look at every aspect of your education. Like I've been kind of starting to look into TCs now, and they're asking for my GCSEs, for my A levels, and then every individual class, every individual module at my degree level, because I'm non-law as well. I graduated last year in criminology, and I was just wondering, I guess with the experience in Canada, do you think they're just as detail orientated in the sense that they will look at your A levels or look at every step you've taken in education, even though you're qualified in the UK, kind of thing?
Yes. In answer to that, very simply, yes, they will look to make sure that your exam results are consistent, so that you didn't tank your GCSEs, but then you suddenly peaked. They want a level of consistency of ability and academic history. But their focus will be on your university, but you do have to provide your GCSEs and A levels, and you do have to provide the transcript from university with each course breakdown.
And are they just as selective as in the UK? So I know, so I live in Vancouver right now, and I know that UVic and UAT and Dalhousie and UBC are all held in such high regard. They're kind of like the UCL and kind of King's College of Canada. Do they take that approach as well? Because you said they don't really understand UK unis, because obviously they don't understand half the names that we have. But do you think
if there's somebody on the recruitment panel who happens to know anything about the country you're from or the university that you've mentioned, if you've gone to a red brick university, or Oxford or Cambridge, then it might pique their interest. But honestly, they need you to have that NCA certificate of qualification. That's what they're looking for at that point. So yeah, it's kind of a bit of a bummer, really, on that one. But I mean, I went to Leeds Met to do my GDL, and then I went to BPP, and they had absolutely no idea what those institutions were. But I mean, I still got an articling position. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, hopefully this answered your question as well, Jennifer. And I think Sahil is probably on a client call for some reason. So
sorry guys, I need to get off. I've got my assistant on the line saying the witness is waiting. I need to speak to the witness.
No worries. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, and please reach out if you ever have questions. Take care.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, then
bye.
I think I think, yeah, thank you so much, Sahil. And I think definitely it's probably we can do another session later on if there are really that many questions from the audience as well. And I think probably we'll take one last question due to the matter of time as well, because the session has been running for almost an hour and like 20 minutes already. So I think the last question will be for Jasmine. If you want to ask that question, then probably it will call for the end of the day. So Jasmine, you can ask the question if you're still here.
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask in terms of the practice areas. So I want to get into litigation and dispute resolution, but from what I've heard from conversations with people, getting into a foreign legal market, and that to litigation, is traditionally harder. Being a barrister is traditionally harder than possibly getting into the corporate law practice with firms. So, and I've also, spoken to people who've actually, after completing their legal qualifications in India, have also chosen the route to again do their 3-year JD in Canada. Simply because they felt that it was much harder to break into the litigation market here, and this would possibly give them a better platform for this. And I have also applied for LLM programs as also upper standing 2-year JD programs in Canada. But again, in terms of spending that much time and resources in education, again, after having completed the legal degree or already in India, do you think it's worth the the time and the money being invested again? Or do you think you've known people who've been successful in entering the market just either with clearing the LLM or just the NCA writing the exams on their own?
I'm going to chime in. I think a lot of the times when we kind of give these kind of anecdotes, there's the exceptions to the rules, and then there are the rules. I think everyone needs to take a hint of salt of what we're telling you. There's no guarantees to this path. Doing the NCAs is no guarantee. Getting the LLM is no guarantee. I've known people that are Canadians that went abroad, that came back 5 years, can't find articling, and eventually decided not to pursue qualification. There are those that came back within a year, got articling right away. So it is completely up in the air, and I can't stress this enough, there's no guarantee in this path. Even doing a Canadian LLM that does the NCA and whatnot, it does not guarantee you a role or an interview or anything. So it's really hard to answer that, only because we don't want to give you the false impression that it is going to be easy. From our experience, it actually has been quite hard. Right. But if Canada is where you want to be, you want to kind of build a career, build a life here, I think it's worth it to try. Yeah.
I would agree, and the same with a JD program. There's no guarantee. There are an awful lot of JD candidates who have not been successful in finding articling positions. So there really is no guarantee. But as Daniel says, if you really want this, you will make it happen. And that's part of being a lawyer, is that you're tenacious and you're driven and you're willing to put in the work to make it happen. So I think we've run out of time for questions. I know loads of you still had your hands up. People were like literally waving on their cameras to try and get our attention. If you do have questions, please do message us. Daniel, Sahil, and myself, we're on LinkedIn. You can send us an invitation, ask us a question. We also, as an organization, Global Lawyers of Canada, we do virtual mentor office hours every Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, which is 8 p.m. Eastern time. We record those sessions. There's about 10 sessions on our YouTube channel. Just type in Global Lawyers of Canada, you will find it. Many of your questions so far have been answered in those previous sessions, and we have a whole bunch more sessions lined up for the rest of the year, and we'd be happy to talk on any topics you guys have. So please do message us if there's a specific topic that you want to hear about, but do message us with your questions, which we'll do our very, very best to answer them for you.
Yeah, and yeah, probably is almost the end of today's session, and thank you so much for all of you who turned in. I think it's better for Siobhan and Daniel to leave their contact information on the chat or LinkedIn links so that they could potentially reach out to you guys. And also Sahil, I think you guys can easily find him on LinkedIn as well by typing his name there. So I'm really happy like all of you guys who are participating for this session, and do check out Global Lawyers of Canada for any specific Canadian legal market advice. And also do check out GlobalLawyersConnect as well, because we not only talk about Canadian legal market, we also talk about a bunch of different legal markets. And hopefully in the future, we'll also organize another moderated Q&A session so that to answer some of you guys' questions again, and to, so that you guys like can help most of you guys, as many of you as possible as well. So thank you so much, Siobhan and Daniel, for today's session. And just if you guys want, you can definitely add them now. I think they already leave the details there. So just reach out to as many people as possible. I think this is probably the best way to answer some of you guys' questions as well, because you guys may have a lot of questions on LLM or whether JD is a worthwhile option. I think the best way to learn those experiences is to actually reach out to people and talk to people who went through the same in the past. And I think by doing so, you can really connect yourself with other people in different parts of the world and break into another legal market. So I'll just end it on this positive note. And hopefully we will see you guys again. And before I end this meeting, do two of you, Daniel and Siobhan, do you want to say anything else at the end? Or it's okay to, Daniel, do you have any final works?
Just that, like user support network, we're here to help you. It's not impossible, but it is hard. It's going to be hard. So definitely, if you're in it for the long haul, go for it. And best of luck.
Same. If you really want it, you'll make it happen. Use your network. Do your due diligence. Look at all of the links we've sent you, and if that doesn't answer your questions, then reach out to people and ask questions. And we look forward to seeing you all again. And Gordon, thanks very much for having us and joining with Global Lawyers of Canada this morning or this afternoon or this evening, wherever you are in the world watching this, so that we could share our journeys with all of you. And we look forward to getting to know all of you and hearing about your journeys as we go forward.
Thank you so much again. And guys, definitely today, the fact that you joined this event, you're already taking the first step of breaking into the Canadian legal market for sure. And I will see you guys again for next time. And bye everyone. Have a lovely day.